The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Morrison mansion in Westchester County, like angry fists demanding entry. Victoria Chen Morrison pressed her palm against her 6-month pregnant belly as another crack of thunder shook the 20-room estate she had called home for 8 years of marriage. Tonight, it felt like a prison. Victoria, pack your bags. Now. The cold, commanding voice of her millionaire ex-husband-to-be cut through the storm's fury. Richard Morrison stood in the doorway of their master bedroom, his 45-year-old face carved from stone, his tech executive bearing as rigid as the expensive suit he still wore despite the late hour. "Richard, what are you talking about?" Victoria's voice came out softer than she intended, with that slight pause before difficult words that had developed over years of walking on eggshells. "Do not pretend you do not know." He never used contractions, even in anger. "The text message on my phone. You read it." Victoria's heart hammered against her ribs. She had read it. A message from someone named Cassandra that said, "Can't wait for you to leave her. The Hamptons house will be perfect for us. Richard, we need to talk about this. I am 6 months pregnant. The doctor said many things." Richard's laugh sounded like ice cracking. "How do I even know it is mine?" The words hit Victoria like a physical blow. She gripped the edge of their marble dresser, the same one where she had discovered his hidden financial documents 3 months ago. Documents that showed money disappearing into offshore accounts, business deals that looked suspiciously like fraud. "You cannot be serious." "I am always serious." "Victoria, you have 30 minutes to pack whatever you can carry." Thunder crashed overhead, and the lights flickered. Through the windows, Victoria could see trees bending nearly horizontal in the wind. The Weather Service had issued warnings about flooding and downed power lines. "Richard, please listen to me. The storm. My pregnancy is high risk. You know what Dr. Martinez said about stress?" "Dr. Martinez." He spoke the name like it tasted bitter. "Another one of your little allies, I suppose. Like that sister of yours who has been filling your head with nonsense about financial independence?" Victoria's pulse quickened. He knew about Sarah's visits, about the conversations they had been having. Her sister, a successful tech entrepreneur, had been helping Victoria understand the maze of their finances, teaching her about assets and legal rights she never knew she had. "Sarah is trying to help me understand our situation." "Our situation?" Richard stepped closer, and Victoria caught the scent of expensive cologne mixed with something harder. Whiskey. "There is no our situation anymore. There is my situation, which you have been attempting to complicate." The baby, as he cut her off. "Yes, let us discuss the baby. Convenient timing. Was it not right when I was planning to restructure our financial arrangements?" Victoria felt her world tilting. "You think I planned this pregnancy to trap you?" "I think you are more calculating than you pretend to be. Just like when you threatened to tell my business partners about those documents you should never have seen." There it was, the real reason for his rage. Victoria had confronted him 2 weeks ago about the irregularities she had discovered, the missing funds, the suspicious transactions. She had not threatened him, merely asked for explanations. But Richard Morrison, millionaire tech executive, was not accustomed to being questioned by anyone, especially not his wife. "I never threatened you, Richard. I asked for honesty." "You asked for ammunition." His voice dropped to a whisper that somehow felt more dangerous than shouting. "You wanted leverage for the divorce you have been planning." "What divorce? I never said anything about." "You did not have to say it. I can see it in your eyes. You think you can take half of everything I built. You think you can destroy my reputation with wild accusations about my business practices?" Victoria pressed both hands against her belly, feeling their daughter moving restlessly inside her, as if sensing the tension filling the room. "Richard, I do not want to destroy anything. I want to understand what happened to us. What happened is that you became greedy." He turned toward their walk-in closet and pulled out a leather suitcase, throwing it onto their king-sized bed. "What happened is that you forgot your place. My place. The words came out sharper than Victoria intended. You were nobody when I met you, a graduate student drowning in debt. I gave you this life, this house, everything you have, and now you want to bite the hand that fed you. Victoria watched him yank her clothes from hangers, tossing them carelessly into the suitcase. Each garment felt like a piece of her life being discarded. Designer dresses she had worn to his company events, always smiling, always supporting his ambitions while her own dreams gathered dust. I gave up my career for you, she said quietly. You gave up a career that was going nowhere, teaching literature to bored college students. I saved you from a life of mediocrity. I love teaching. You love the idea of teaching, just like you love the idea of being a victim now. Victoria felt something shift inside her, a tiny spark of the woman she used to be before years of narcissistic abuse had worn her down to silence and compliance. I am not playing victim. Richard, I am asking my husband to explain why our financial records look like a shell game. His hand stilled on the suitcase. When he turned to face her, his expression had gone completely cold. You want to know about finances, here is what you need to know. The prenuptial agreement you signed gives you nothing in case of adultery or abandonment, and I have evidence of both. Evidence of what I have never been unfaithful, and I am not abandoning anything. The pregnancy? His smile was sharp as broken glass. Genetic testing will prove it is not mine, and your sudden interest in our finances proves you were planning to leave with my money. Victoria felt the room spinning. You want genetic testing? Fine, test the baby. She is yours, Richard. How can you even doubt that she, his eyebrows rose, already planning the gender reveal party, already spending my money on pink nursery furniture. The ultrasound showed what you wanted it to show. He zipped the suitcase closed with violent efficiency. Just like those financial documents you claim to have found, planted evidence to support your narrative. Planted by whom, Richard? Listen to yourself. You are creating conspiracy theories to avoid taking responsibility for your own actions. My actions? He lifted the suitcase and set it on the floor with a thud. My actions built a $50 million company. My actions purchased this house, paid for your clothes, your car, your comfortable life. What actions of yours am I supposed to take responsibility for? Another flash of lightning illuminated the room, followed immediately by thunder. The storm was directly overhead now, and Victoria could hear Elena Rodriguez, their housekeeper, moving around downstairs, probably closing windows and checking for leaks. Elena, the one person in this house who treated Victoria like a human being instead of an accessory to Richard's success. Elena, who brought her tea during morning sickness and asked about the baby with genuine warmth. Elena, who had been working for Richard for 12 years and had seen how his treatment of Victoria had changed over time. You have 15 minutes left, Richard said, checking his expensive watch. I suggest you use them wisely. Where am I supposed to go, Richard? It is after midnight, and there is a severe storm warning. That is not my problem anymore. What about tomorrow's prenatal appointment? Dr. Martinez wants to check the baby's growth measurements. Cancel it. Find another doctor. One your insurance will cover. My insurance? Victoria felt panic rising in her throat. Richard, I am on your insurance, through your company. Not after tonight. He walked to his bedside table and pulled out a manila envelope. Separation papers. Sign them, and you will have 30 days of COBRA coverage. Refuse to sign, and you will have nothing. Victoria stared at the envelope like it was a snake. You had these prepared in advance. I had them prepared the moment you started asking questions about things that were none of your business. Our marriage is my business. Our financial security is my business. Our baby's future is my business. Our baby, he shook his head. You keep saying that like it means something. Like biology creates obligation. Biology, Victoria felt her voice breaking. Richard, we have been trying to get pregnant for 3 years. You said you wanted children? You said, I said many things. People change their minds when circumstances change. What circumstances? What changed? Richard moved to the bedroom window and stared out at the storm. Trees bent and swayed in the wind, and Victoria could see debris flying past. The local news had warned people to stay indoors, to avoid travel unless absolutely necessary. "What changed?" he said without turning around. "Is that I realized I could do better." The words hung in the air between them like poison. Victoria felt something breaking inside her chest. Not just her heart, but her entire understanding of the man she had married. "Cassandra," she whispered. "Cassandra appreciates what I have built. She understands the kind of life I can provide without constantly questioning my methods. Your methods include hiding money from your wife and potentially defrauding your business partners." Richard spun around, and for a moment Victoria thought he might strike her. Instead, he smiled, and somehow that was worse. "Prove it," he said softly. "Take your accusations to court. See how far they get you without evidence, without money for lawyers, without a place to live. I have evidence. Those documents will disappear along with everything else that belongs to me, including access to this house, my cars, my accounts, my life." Victoria realized with growing horror that he had been planning this for weeks, maybe months. The sudden business trips, the late-night phone calls, the way he had been asking her seemingly casual questions about her family, her friends, her support system. He had been mapping out her vulnerabilities, preparing to cut off every avenue of help. "Elena," Victoria said suddenly, "Elena has seen things. She knows about your behavior, your treatment of me. Elena is an employee who will say whatever I pay her to say. She has family in Mexico who depend on the money I send them every month. Do you think she will risk their welfare for your sob story?" Another thunderclap shook the house, and the lights flickered again before going out completely. Emergency lighting kicked in, casting eerie shadows across the bedroom. "How fitting," Richard said into the darkness. "Even the power company is on my side tonight." Victoria felt her way to the bed and sat down heavily, her hands instinctively protecting her belly. "Richard, please, I am begging you. Let me stay until morning. Let me call my sister. Your sister who has been poisoning you against me. Your sister who thinks she can teach you to be independent." He laughed. "Call her if you want, but you will do it from somewhere else." Victoria heard footsteps in the hallway, and then Elena's voice, soft and worried. "Senor Morrison, Senora Victoria, the power, it is out everywhere. Very dangerous to drive tonight." "Elena," Richard called out, his voice suddenly warm and charming. "Perfect timing. Please help my wife carry her suitcase to her car." "Her car?" Elena appeared in the doorway, her weathered face creased with confusion. "Senor, the storm is very bad. The roads are flooding. My wife has decided she needs some space to think about our marriage. She has asked to stay elsewhere for a while." Victoria started to protest, but Richard's sharp look silenced her. She realized that any contradiction would put Elena in an impossible position, caught between her loyalty to Victoria and her need to keep her job. "I will drive her myself," Elena said quietly. "My car is older, but it sits higher than the Mercedes." "That will not be necessary," Richard replied. "Victoria is perfectly capable of driving herself. Are you not, darling?" The endearment sounded like mockery. Victoria looked at Elena's concerned face and made a decision that would change everything. "Actually," Victoria said, standing up and lifting her chin, "I think I will be fine on my own." She picked up the suitcase, heavier than she expected, and walked toward the door. As she passed Richard, he leaned close enough that only she could hear his words. "Get out of my house," and he whispered. "The storm can have you for all I care." Victoria paused in the doorway and turned back to look at the room where she had slept beside this man for 8 years, where she had dreamed of raising children, where she had slowly lost pieces of herself until she barely recognized who she had become. "You are right about one thing, Richard," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "People do change their minds when circumstances change, and my circumstances are about to change dramatically." She walked out of the room, Elena following anxiously behind her, and did not look back. The last thing she heard before the bedroom door closed was Richard's voice, cold and final. Good riddance. Meanwhile, downstairs in the mansion's marble foyer, Elena hurried to keep pace with Victoria's determined stride. The housekeeper's worn hands fluttered nervously as she watched her employer's wife head toward the front door. "Signora Victoria," Elena whispered, her accent thick with worry. "You know should be driving in this storm. The baby, she needs you safe." Victoria paused at the massive oak door, her hand trembling on the brass handle. Through the side windows, she could see her BMW sedan parked in the circular driveway, already covered with fallen branches and debris. The wind howled like a living thing, and rain struck the windows with the force of thrown stones. "I know, Elena, but I cannot stay here another minute. Where will you go, your sister? She lives in the city. No very far in this weather." Victoria's mind raced through her limited options. Sarah lived in Manhattan, at least an hour away in good weather. Tonight, with flooding and road closures, it might be impossible to reach her. Victoria's parents had retired to Florida 5 years ago. Her few remaining friends from college had drifted away during her marriage to Richard, slowly excluded from her life until her world had shrunk to the size of this mansion. "I will figure something out," Victoria said, though her voice lacked conviction. Elena disappeared for a moment and returned with a thermos and a plastic bag. "Coffee, still hot, and I make you some sandwiches. You need to eat for the baby." The kindness in Elena's gesture nearly broke Victoria's composure. When had she last felt genuine care from another human being? When had Richard last worried about whether she had eaten or slept or felt safe? "Elena, I need to ask you something," Victoria said quietly. "The things you have seen in this house, the way Richard treats me, if someone asked you to tell the truth about it, would you?" Elena's dark eyes filled with pain. "Senora, I have a daughter. She is studying to be a nurse, and her school. It costs much money. My grandson, he needs surgery for his heart condition. Senor Morrison, he helps with these things." Victoria understood. Elena was trapped just as surely as she had been, dependent on Richard's generosity for her family's survival. But there was something else in the housekeeper's expression, a flicker of resolve that gave Victoria hope. "But if the law protects me and my family," Elena continued slowly, "if there is a way to tell the truth without losing everything, then yes, Senora, I would tell what I have seen." Victoria squeezed Elena's hand. "Thank you. That means more than you know." A tremendous crash of thunder shook the house, and the emergency lights flickered ominously. Through the windows, Victoria could see tree limbs snapping under the wind's assault. "This is madness," Elena muttered. "No person should be out in this weather." "Elena, I pack for you. See, you know should be doing this yourself," came Richard's mocking voice from the top of the stairs. He was imitating Elena's speech pattern with cruel precision, and Victoria felt rage burn in her chest. "How dare you?" she called up to him. "Elena has shown me more kindness in 5 minutes than you have in months." "Elena is paid to show you kindness," Richard replied, descending the stairs with predatory grace. "Just as you were paid to be my wife, but your contract has been terminated." Victoria gripped the suitcase handle tighter. "I was never paid to be your wife. Richard, I was supposed to be your partner. Partners contribute equally to the relationship. What exactly have you contributed besides your presence and your opinions about my business decisions?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Victoria thought about the charity work she had done for his company's public image, the networking events where she had charmed potential clients, the countless evenings she had entertained his business associates while setting aside her own ambitions. She thought about the book manuscript she had been working on when they married, abandoned now in a digital folder she had not opened in years. "I contributed 8 years of my life," she said simply. 8 years of living in luxury while contributing nothing of value. Most people would call that a fair trade. Elena made a small sound of distress, and Victoria realized the housekeeper was witnessing the final destruction of what she had probably hoped was a loving marriage. How many nights had Elena heard arguments through these walls, How many mornings had she seen the aftermath of Richard's psychological warfare? "I am leaving now," Victoria announced, pulling open the heavy door. The storm rushed in like an invading army. Wind and rain struck her with such force that she staggered backward, her pregnant belly throwing off her balance. The suitcase was nearly torn from her grip. "You cannot drive in this," Elena shouted over the wind. "The baby. The baby will be fine once we are away from here," Victoria replied, though she had to lean into the doorframe to keep from being blown over. Richard appeared beside them, seemingly unaffected by the chaos. Having second thoughts, "There is still time to sign the separation papers and wait for morning." Victoria looked at him through the wind and rain, at his perfectly styled hair now being whipped around his face, at his expensive clothes that no amount of money could make impressive in this moment. She realized that this man, this millionaire ex-husband-to-be, who controlled every aspect of their shared life, had no power over the storm. Nature did not care about his money or his threats or his carefully crafted image. "No second thoughts," she said. "Only regret that it took me this long to see who you really are." She stepped into the storm. The wind immediately tried to knock her sideways, and the rain soaked through her lightweight sweater within seconds. Each step toward her car felt like a battle, and she could hear Elena calling her name from the doorway, begging her to come back. The BMW's door handle was slippery with rain, and it took 3 tries to get it open. By the time Victoria collapsed into the driver's seat, she was completely drenched and shaking from cold and shock. She fumbled with the key, her hands trembling too badly to fit it into the ignition. Through the windshield, she could see the mansion's front door standing open, warm light spilling out onto the dark driveway. Richard stood silhouetted in the doorway like a figure from a nightmare, watching her struggle. He made no move to help, showed no concern for her safety or that of their unborn child. Finally, the engine turned over. Victoria put the car in reverse and began backing out of the driveway, her headlights cutting weak paths through the driving rain. Visibility was almost zero, and she had to rely on memory to navigate the curved drive. As she reached the road, a massive oak branch crashed down exactly where her car had been parked moments before. The impact shook the ground and sent a shower of sparks from the downed power line it had taken with it. Victoria sat in her car at the end of the driveway, wipers struggling against the torrential rain, and realized she had no idea where to go. The roads looked like rivers, and every few seconds, lightning illuminated a landscape transformed into something alien and dangerous. She pulled out her phone to call Sarah, but there was no signal. The storm had knocked out the cell towers, cutting her off from her only lifeline. For the first time since the confrontation began, Victoria felt truly alone. She was 6 months pregnant, homeless, and trapped in a car in the middle of the worst storm in years. The man she had loved and trusted had thrown her out like garbage, caring more about his image and his money than her life or their baby's safety. She thought about the choice every woman fears: protect yourself or try to save something that is already dead. For 8 years, she had chosen to stay and fight for their marriage, making herself smaller and smaller until she had nearly disappeared. Tonight, by choosing to leave, she was choosing to fight for something else entirely. Her daughter, her own life, her future. Victoria put the car in drive and pulled onto the flooded road, not knowing where it would lead but knowing she could never go back. Behind her, the mansion's lights grew smaller in her rearview mirror until they disappeared entirely, swallowed by the storm that was carrying her toward an uncertain but autonomous future. 3 hours later, as Victoria's car hydroplaned on the slick road and spun sideways into a concrete barrier, she would understand that sometimes the most dangerous storms are the ones that finally set you free. The impact threw her forward against the steering wheel, and she felt a sharp pain in her abdomen before everything went dark. Her last conscious thought was a prayer for her daughter's safety and a promise that Richard Morrison would pay for what he had done. 3 hours later, at Mercy General Hospital, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Victoria drifted in and out of consciousness on a narrow emergency room bed. The antiseptic smell mixed with the lingering scent of rain from her soaked clothes, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the steady beep of monitoring equipment. "Dr. Martinez, We need you in Trauma Bay 3, came the announcement over the hospital speakers. What do we have? Dr. Martinez asked, her voice professional but urgent as her footsteps approached Victoria's bed. Pregnant female, approximately 35 years old, took a fall after a vehicle accident. She is conscious but disoriented. 6 months gestation, previous high-risk designation due to her age and history of miscarriage. Victoria's eyes fluttered open to see Dr. Martinez's concerned face hovering above her. The doctor was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Victoria had been seeing her for prenatal care for 4 months, and Dr. Martinez was one of the few people who had noticed the increasing stress Victoria carried at each appointment. "Victoria, can you hear me?" Dr. Martinez asked gently. "You are at Mercy General. You were in a car accident." "The baby," Victoria whispered, her hands moving instinctively to her belly. "Is she okay? We are checking on her right now. Can you tell me what happened tonight?" Victoria tried to organize her thoughts through the haze of pain medication and shock. The confrontation with Richard felt like something from a nightmare, but the throbbing in her ribs and the scratches on her hands proved it had been real. "My husband, my millionaire ex-husband." Victoria caught herself. They were not divorced yet, though after tonight that seemed inevitable. "Richard threw me out of the house during the storm. I had nowhere to go, so I tried to drive to my sister's apartment in the city." Dr. Martinez's expression darkened. "He made you leave during a severe weather warning while you are 6 months pregnant with a high-risk pregnancy? He found out I knew about his financial irregularities. About the affair, he said the baby might not be his and that I had 30 minutes to pack whatever I could carry." A nurse appeared at Victoria's bedside, checking the monitors and making notes on a chart. Victoria noticed the woman's nameplate read Susan Chen and felt a small spark of connection. Chen was Victoria's maiden name, a piece of her identity she had lost when she became Mrs. Morrison. "The fetal heartbeat is strong," Nurse Chen reported, "but we should do an ultrasound to check for any trauma-related complications." "Agreed," Dr. Martinez said. "Victoria, I need to examine you for injuries, and then we will make sure your daughter is healthy." As Dr. Martinez worked, Victoria found herself telling the story of the evening in fragmented pieces. The text message from Cassandra, Richard's accusation that the pregnancy was planned to trap him financially, the separation papers he had already prepared, his refusal to let her stay until morning, despite the dangerous weather conditions. "Has your husband been physically abusive before tonight?" Dr. Martinez asked carefully. "Not physically, but..." Victoria struggled to find words for the psychological warfare that had defined the last years of her marriage. "He controls everything. Money, social contacts, my access to information about our finances. He makes me feel like I am crazy for questioning things that seem wrong. That is called financial abuse and emotional manipulation," Dr. Martinez said bluntly. "And forcing you to leave your home during a dangerous storm while pregnant could be considered criminal endangerment." Victoria felt a shock of recognition. She had begun to think of Richard's behavior as normal, the price of being married to a successful man with strong opinions. Hearing Dr. Martinez name it as abuse felt like being handed a key to a door she had not realized was locked. "Dr. Martinez," Victoria said slowly, "if someone wanted to build a legal case about endangerment and financial abuse, what kind of evidence would they need?" Medical records documenting stress-related complications during pregnancy would be a start. Witness testimony about controlling behavior. Financial documents showing hidden assets or restricted access to marital funds. Dr. Martinez paused in her examination. "Victoria, are you considering taking legal action?" Before Victoria could answer, commotion erupted in the hallway outside her room. She heard a familiar voice, loud and authoritative, demanding information about his wife's condition. "That is Richard," Victoria whispered, panic rising in her throat. Dr. Martinez straightened up, her professional demeanor shifting into something more protective. "You do not have to see him if you do not want to. Patient privacy laws allow you to refuse visitors. He will make a scene. He hates being told no, especially by women he thinks are beneath him." Then he is about to learn about hospital security procedures, Dr. Martinez said grimly. The curtain around Victoria's bed was suddenly yanked aside, and Richard Morrison strode in wearing a tailored coat over his expensive suit. Despite the late hour in the storm, he looked perfectly composed, every hair in place, projecting the confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way. "Victoria," he said, his voice carrying that tone of manufactured concern he used in front of other people. "Thank God you are safe. I have been worried sick since you left." Dr. Martinez stepped between Richard and Victoria's bed. "Mr. Morrison, visiting hours ended at 9 p.m. Additionally, this patient has requested—" "This patient is my wife," Richard interrupted, his charm already beginning to fray. "I have every right to see her." "Actually, you do not," Dr. Martinez replied calmly. "Patient privacy laws supersede marital relationships. Your wife has requested no visitors." Victoria watched Richard's face cycle through emotions, surprise, anger, and then a calculating coldness she knew well. This was the expression he wore when someone had underestimated his ability to control a situation. "Dr. Martinez, is it—" Richard read her nameplate and smiled. "I think there has been a misunderstanding. My wife is not thinking clearly right now. She has been under tremendous stress due to some marital difficulties we have been working through. I am sure she did not mean to exclude me from her medical care." "Mr. Morrison," Dr. Martinez said, her voice gaining steel, "your wife is conscious, competent, and capable of making her own decisions about her medical care. She has clearly stated that she does not wish to see you tonight." "Victoria," Richard said, speaking past Dr. Martinez as if she were invisible, "tell the doctor this is all a misunderstanding. Tell her you want me here to support you through this difficult time." Victoria felt the familiar pressure to smooth things over, to avoid conflict, to protect Richard's image even when he was hurting her. For 8 years, she had been trained to prioritize his comfort over her own needs. But lying in this hospital bed, connected to monitors tracking her daughter's heartbeat, she found herself thinking about different priorities. "Richard," she said quietly, "I want you to leave." His mask of concern slipped completely. "You are making a mistake, Victoria. You are emotional and not thinking clearly about the consequences of your actions. The only mistake I made was trusting you to care about my safety and our baby's well-being." "Our baby," Richard's voice took on that mocking tone Victoria knew too well. "I thought we had established that paternity was questionable?" Dr. Martinez's eyebrows rose. "Mr. Morrison, are you seriously questioning the paternity of your wife's pregnancy while she is recovering from an accident you may have contributed to?" "I did not contribute to anything," Richard snapped. "My wife chose to leave our home against my advice. Her poor judgment led to this situation." "Your advice," Victoria found her voice growing stronger. "You threw me out in a storm after calling our daughter a bastard and threatening to cut off my health insurance." "I never used that word. You said you did not know if she was yours. You demanded genetic testing. You called me calculating and greedy for asking questions about our finances." Victoria sat up straighter in the hospital bed, ignoring the pain in her ribs. "Richard, there are witnesses to everything you said tonight." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Richard's face. "What witnesses?" "Elena heard everything. She saw you force me to pack in 30 minutes. She watched you make me leave in dangerous weather while knowing I am high risk. Elena is an employee who will say whatever. Elena is a human being who has watched you emotionally abuse your pregnant wife for months," Dr. Martinez interrupted. "And if she is willing to testify about what she witnessed, that testimony could be very valuable in court." Richard's composure finally cracked. "Court Victoria, what exactly do you think you are going to accomplish here? You signed a prenuptial agreement. You have no independent income, no assets in your own name, no legal standing to challenge anything I have done. I have something better than money. Richard, I have the truth." "The truth?" He laughed, but it sounded forced. "The truth is that you are an unstable woman who endangered her own pregnancy by driving recklessly in a storm. The truth is that you have been planning to extort money from me using false accusations about my business practices. Mr. Morrison, Dr. Martinez said firmly, I am going to ask you to leave now. Your presence is causing distress to my patient, which could compromise her pregnancy. You cannot throw me out. I am her husband. I can and I will. Hospital security is already on their way. As if summoned by her words, two security officers appeared in the doorway. Richard looked from them to Dr. Martinez to Victoria, calculating his options like the businessman he was. This is not over, Victoria, he said quietly. You are making enemies you cannot afford to make. No, Richard, I am finally standing up to the enemy I could not afford to keep. He turned and walked out without another word, his expensive shoes clicking against the hospital floor. Victoria watched him go and felt something she had not experienced in years, relief at his absence instead of anxiety about his return. How are you feeling? Dr. Martinez asked once Richard was gone. Scared, Victoria admitted, but also free. Is that strange? Not at all. Many women describe leaving abusive relationships as terrifying and liberating at the same time. Dr. Martinez checked the fetal monitor again. Your daughter's heartbeat is still strong. I think she is as ready to be free from that toxic environment as you are. Victoria placed her hands on her belly and felt her daughter moving. I am going to protect you, she whispered. Whatever it takes, I am going to make sure you grow up knowing your worth. As if in response, her daughter kicked firmly against Victoria's ribs, and for the first time in hours, Victoria smiled. The next morning, as Victoria woke to the sound of breakfast carts rolling down hospital corridors, sunlight streamed through her room's window like a promise that the storm had passed. Her body ached from the accident, but her mind felt clearer than it had in months. Someone had brought her a change of clothes, soft cotton pajamas that smelled like Elena's gentle detergent. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts, and a woman with short black hair and designer glasses peered in. Victoria recognized her immediately despite the years that had passed since their last face-to-face conversation. Sarah, Victoria breathed. Victoria. Sarah Chen burst into the room with the energy of a woman accustomed to solving problems quickly. At 38, Victoria's sister had built a successful tech startup from nothing, and her confidence filled the space like warm light. Holy shit, Victoria. When Elena called me at 5 in the morning, Sarah caught herself and lowered her voice. Sorry, I have been practicing not swearing since I heard about the baby. How are you feeling? Elena called you? Victoria felt a wave of gratitude for the housekeeper's quiet rebellion against Richard's control. She tracked down my number and called from her personal phone. Smart woman. She said Richard threw you out in the storm and you ended up here. Sarah pulled up a chair next to Victoria's bed. Please tell me you are planning to destroy him in court. Victoria managed a weak laugh. I am planning to survive him in court. Destroying him might be beyond my current resources. That is where you are wrong, sister. Sarah pulled out her tablet and opened a folder full of documents. I spent the night doing some research on your millionaire ex-husband. Richard Morrison has made some very interesting financial moves in the past 6 months. What kind of moves? The kind that suggest he was preparing for a divorce long before you found that text message. Shell companies in the Cayman Islands, property transfers to trusts that somehow do not include your name, business partnerships that look suspiciously like ways to hide assets from matrimonial property division. Victoria felt her pulse quicken. You found evidence of financial fraud. I found evidence of financial planning that assumes his wife would never think to look at the bigger picture. Richard has been moving money around like a man who expects to lose half his assets in a divorce settlement. Sarah's eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of someone who enjoyed solving complex puzzles. The problem is, he did not expect his wife to have a sister who specializes in financial technology and forensic accounting. Another knock interrupted them, and a woman in her 60s entered with the bearing of someone accustomed to commanding respect in courtrooms. Margaret Williams wore a conservative navy suit and carried herself with the authority of 30 years practicing family law. Victoria, I presume I am Margaret Williams. Elena gave me your sister's contact information, and Sarah asked me to consult on your situation. Margaret's voice carried the measured cadence of a woman who chose her words carefully. But there was warmth underneath the professional exterior. Victoria could immediately see why Sarah had chosen this particular attorney. Margaret has handled some of the most complex financial abuse cases in the state, Sarah explained, including several involving tech executives who thought they were too smart to get caught hiding assets. Margaret sat down and opened a leather portfolio. Victoria, I need you to tell me everything that happened last night, but first I want you to understand something important. What your husband did forcing you to leave your home during a dangerous storm while 6 months pregnant with a high-risk pregnancy that constitutes criminal endangerment under New York state law. Criminal? Victoria had been thinking in terms of divorce and custody, not criminal charges. Absolutely. Add in the financial abuse Sarah has uncovered, and we have the foundation for both criminal charges and a civil lawsuit that could recover significant damages. Victoria felt overwhelmed. 24 hours ago, she had been focused on saving her marriage. Now she was hearing words like criminal charges and financial recovery that made her situation sound like something from a legal thriller. Margaret, I appreciate your help, but I do not know if I am ready for a war with Richard. He has unlimited resources and connections throughout the business community. My dear, Margaret said gently, he has already declared war on you. Last night was not a marital dispute. It was an assault on your safety and your baby's well-being. We are simply choosing to fight back strategically instead of being victims. Sarah leaned forward in her chair. Victoria, you need to hear this. I ran those numbers you asked me to look at 6 months ago. Richard has been systematically moving assets out of your joint accounts and into offshore structures since last spring. He has been planning this divorce for almost a year. Victoria felt the room tilting. A year, but we were trying to get pregnant. He said he wanted children. He wanted you pregnant and dependent while he prepared to leave you with nothing, Margaret said bluntly. It is a classic pattern in financially abusive relationships. Create maximum dependency, then exploit it for maximum control. What do you mean? Sarah pulled up a document on her tablet. Look at this. Richard increased your life insurance policy to $5 million in April. He also set up a new business partnership that would allow him to claim most of his assets are tied up in ongoing ventures that cannot be liquidated for divorce settlements. Victoria stared at the screen, trying to process what her sister was telling her. He increased my life insurance, while decreasing his own coverage and moving liquid assets offshore, Margaret added. From a legal perspective, it looks like he was preparing for scenarios that did not include you surviving long enough to claim matrimonial property. The implications hit Victoria like cold water. You think he was planning to have me killed? I think he was planning for possibilities that would solve his financial problems permanently, Margaret said carefully. What happened last night forcing you out in dangerous weather while pregnant could be seen as testing whether fate would solve his problems for him. Victoria pressed her hands against her belly, feeling her daughter's movements. The idea that Richard might have been hoping for her death, or at least not caring if she died, was almost too horrific to process. How could I have been so blind? She whispered. You were not blind, Sarah said firmly. You were being systematically deceived by someone who specializes in narcissistic abuse and financial manipulation. That is not a character flaw on your part. That is a crime being committed against you. Margaret nodded. Victoria, women in your situation often blame themselves for not seeing the signs earlier. But psychological abuse is designed to undermine your ability to trust your own perceptions. The fact that you started asking questions about the finances shows your instincts were working perfectly. What happens now? Victoria asked. Now we build a case, Margaret replied. We document the endangerment from last night. We analyze the financial evidence Sarah has uncovered. We interview Elena about what she witnessed. And we make sure Richard Morrison learns that there are consequences for treating pregnant women like disposable property. Victoria felt a mixture of fear and determination rising in her chest. What kind of consequences? Financial recovery for the hidden assets, punitive damages for the endangerment, criminal charges if the evidence supports them, and most importantly, A custody arrangement that protects your daughter from growing up around a man who sees women as objects to be controlled? Sarah grinned. Plus, we are going to make sure every business publication in the country knows exactly what kind of man Richard Morrison really is. Corporate boards do not like executives who make headlines for abusing pregnant wives. Is that legal? Absolutely, Margaret said. Truth is an absolute defense against defamation claims. If we can prove Richard committed financial abuse and criminal endangerment, publicizing those facts is not just legal, it is a public service. Victoria thought about the years she had spent protecting Richard's reputation, smiling at company events while her own dreams withered away. She thought about the isolation, the constant questioning of her own judgment, the way she had been trained to prioritize his image over her own well-being. How long will this process take? She asked. That depends on how much evidence we can gather and whether Richard wants to fight or settle, Margaret replied. But Victoria, I want you to understand something. We are not just fighting for money or revenge. We are fighting to establish that men like Richard cannot destroy women's lives without consequences. Even millionaire ex-husbands, especially millionaire ex-husbands, Sarah said. They are used to buying their way out of problems. Time to show Richard Morrison that some problems cannot be solved with money. Victoria looked from her sister to Margaret, feeling something she had not experienced in years, hope backed by genuine support. For the first time since her marriage began, she was not facing Richard's power alone. Okay, she said quietly. Let us make him pay for what he did. Margaret smiled, and Victoria caught a glimpse of the courtroom warrior beneath the grandmother's exterior. My dear, when we are finished with Richard Morrison, he will wish he had simply chosen to be a decent human being. That would have been much cheaper for him, Sarah added with a grin that reminded Victoria of their childhood conspiracy against unfair adults. Outside the hospital window, the storm clouds had completely cleared, leaving behind the kind of crisp blue sky that promised new beginnings. Victoria placed her hands on her belly and felt her daughter responding to the change in her emotional state. You hear that? Little one, she whispered. We are going to be just fine. Across town, in Margaret Williams' law office overlooking Central Park, Victoria sat in a leather chair that had probably witnessed hundreds of similar conversations about marriages that had become battlegrounds. 2 weeks had passed since the storm, and the bruises from her accident had faded. But the clarity about her situation had only grown stronger. The financial evidence is even more damning than we initially thought, Margaret said, spreading documents across her mahogany desk. Richard has been conducting what amounts to a systematic looting of your marital assets. Sarah looked up from her laptop, where she had been analyzing bank records with the intensity of a detective solving a murder case. Look at this timeline. Every major asset transfer coincides with one of your prenatal appointments. He was literally moving money while you were at the doctor discussing your high-risk pregnancy. Victoria studied the documents, seeing her marriage's destruction laid out in spreadsheets and bank statements. He knew exactly when I would be out of the house and unable to monitor our accounts. It gets worse, Margaret continued. We found evidence that Richard has been recording your phone conversations with me and Sarah. The technical equipment was installed in your home phone system 6 months ago. He was spying on me. Victoria felt violation wash over her like cold water. Recording my private conversations. Illegally recording them, Margaret clarified, which makes those recordings inadmissible in court and gives us grounds for additional criminal charges related to invasion of privacy. Sarah shook her head in disgust. This is not a divorce, Victoria. This is a calculated campaign of psychological warfare designed to drive you out of the marriage with nothing. But why, Victoria asked, if he wanted to leave me, why not just ask for a divorce? Why go through all this elaborate deception? Margaret leaned back in her chair, her expression grim. Because a straightforward divorce would have cost him $25 million in asset division. This way, he planned to keep everything while making you look like an unstable gold digger who abandoned the marriage. The perfect crime, Sarah added bitterly. Except he did not count on his wife having a sister who understands financial systems better than he does. Victoria thought about the months of self-doubt Richard had cultivated, making her question her memory, her perceptions, her right to ask questions about their shared life. How long has he been planning this? Based on the financial evidence, at least 18 months, Margaret replied. The pregnancy was not part of his original plan. When you got pregnant, he had to adjust his strategy. Adjust it how? Sarah pulled up another document on her laptop. By making the pregnancy part of the abandonment narrative. If he could prove you left willingly during pregnancy, it would support his claim that you were unstable and unsuitable for significant asset division. Victoria felt her daughter moving and placed her hands protectively over her belly. So throwing me out in the storm was not just cruelty, it was strategy. Exactly. If you had been seriously injured or, Margaret paused, choosing her words carefully. If the outcome had been worse, Richard would have been the grieving widower with no financial obligations and a tragic story that protected his reputation. The implications settled over Victoria like a shroud. Her husband had not just stopped loving her, he had been actively hoping for her destruction. What about Elena? Victoria asked. Is she willing to testify about what she witnessed? More than willing, Margaret replied with a satisfied smile. Elena has been documenting Richard's behavior for 2 years. She has been keeping a journal of incidents, taking photographs of damages to property during his rages, and recording dates and times of verbal abuse. Elena was gathering evidence. Elena was protecting herself, Sarah explained. She told me she has seen this pattern before in other wealthy households where she worked. She knows that when marriages like yours explode, the staff often gets blamed for things they witnessed. Margaret nodded approvingly. Elena is an intelligent woman who understood she might need to prove she was not complicit in any wrongdoing. Her documentation is meticulous and devastating. Can I see it? Margaret hesitated. Victoria, Elena's records are difficult to read. They document systematic psychological abuse that escalated significantly during your pregnancy. I need to see them. I need to understand what she observed that I was too close to recognize. Sarah reached across the desk and squeezed Victoria's hand. Are you sure some of this stuff is pretty brutal to read about yourself? I am sure. Margaret opened a thick folder and handed Victoria a typed document. Elena had her daughter translate her handwritten notes into English for our legal team. Victoria began reading, and with each entry, her understanding of her marriage shifted like pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. March 15th, Mr. Morrison screamed at Mrs. Morrison for leaving dishes in the sink, called her lazy and worthless. She was crying and holding her stomach. I think she was having morning sickness, but could not tell him. April 3rd, Mr. Morrison threw Mrs. Morrison's books away while she was at doctor appointment. When she asked about them, he said she was imagining things. Found books in garbage and saved them in my car. May 22nd, Mrs. Morrison asked me if she seemed crazy because Mr. Morrison says she forgets conversations that never happened. She looks so scared. I told her she is not crazy. June 10th, Mr. Morrison told me to stop being friendly with Mrs. Morrison because she does not deserve kindness. Said if I did not agree, he would report me to immigration. I pretended to agree, but kept being kind to her anyway. Victoria's hands shook as she read entry after entry, documenting the systematic destruction of her self-esteem and autonomy. Seeing it written down in Elena's careful handwriting made the abuse undeniable, even to herself. He was gaslighting me, she whispered. Extensively and deliberately, Margaret confirmed. Elena's documentation shows a clear pattern of psychological manipulation designed to make you doubt your own perceptions and become increasingly dependent on Richard's version of reality. The books, Victoria said suddenly. I remember looking for them and Richard saying I must have donated them. I started to think I was losing my memory. That is exactly what he wanted you to think, Sarah said angrily. God, Victoria, reading this stuff makes me want to punch him in his smug face. Margaret cleared her throat diplomatically. While I understand the sentiment, our focus needs to be on legal remedies rather than physical ones. Though I will admit that after 30 years of family law, Cases like this still make my blood boil. What happens next? Victoria asked. Next, we file a comprehensive lawsuit that includes civil claims for financial abuse, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and endangerment of you and your unborn child. We also file a criminal complaint with the district attorney's office regarding the endangerment and illegal surveillance. Will Richard try to settle out of court? Probably. Men like Richard prefer to solve problems with money rather than face public accountability. But Victoria, I need you to understand something important. If we accept a settlement with a non-disclosure agreement, Richard gets to continue presenting himself as a respectable businessman while we agree to never talk about what he did to you. Victoria thought about the other women she had met at various corporate events over the years. Wives who seemed nervous and apologetic, who deferred to their husbands on every topic. How many of them were living with the kind of abuse she had endured? How many might be helped by seeing that it was possible to fight back? What if we do not settle? She asked. Then we go to trial, and everything becomes public record. Richard's financial crimes, his abuse, the endangerment incident, all of it gets exposed in open court with media coverage. Sarah grinned. Plus, discovery process means we get access to all his records, including communications with his mistress and documentation of any other shady business practices. But it also means months of legal battles, invasive questions about our marriage, and Richard's legal team trying to destroy my credibility in every way possible. Margaret nodded soberly. It will not be easy. Richard will spare no expense trying to paint you as an unstable gold digger who trapped him with a pregnancy and then tried to extort money with false accusations. Except we have evidence that proves every accusation is true, Sarah pointed out. We do, but evidence and public perception are not always the same thing. Richard has spent years cultivating his image as a successful entrepreneur and philanthropist. He will use every resource to protect that image. Victoria looked out Margaret's window at Central Park, where people were walking their dogs and pushing strollers in the afternoon sunshine. Normal people living normal lives without having to calculate the cost of seeking justice from the people who were supposed to love them. If I do this, if we go to trial, what are the chances we actually win? Based on the evidence, we have already gathered 90% chance of significant financial recovery and criminal convictions. Margaret replied confidently. The question is not whether we can win. The question is whether you are prepared for the battle required to get there. Victoria felt her daughter kick and thought about the world she wanted her child to grow up in. A world where powerful men face consequences for abusing the women in their lives. A world where being rich did not mean being above the law. Margaret, she said quietly, I want you to file everything. Criminal charges, civil lawsuit, all of it. No settlements, no non-disclosure agreements. I want the whole truth to come out in open court. Margaret smiled with the satisfaction of a lawyer who had found a client worthy of her best efforts. Victoria, when we are finished with Richard Morrison, he will be a case study in business schools about how narcissistic abuse and financial crimes can destroy even the most successful careers. Good, Victoria replied. Maybe that will save the next woman from going through what I did. Sarah closed her laptop with a snap. Let us go destroy a millionaire ex-husband. Victoria laughed for the first time in weeks. Yes, let us do exactly that. 1 week later, in a coffee shop in downtown Manhattan, Victoria sat at a corner table nursing a decaf latte and watching the lunch crowd rush past the windows. She had chosen this place for its anonymity, somewhere Richard would never think to look for her. Surrounded by people who did not know or care about the Morrison family drama, she was not alone. Carol Henderson sat across from her, a woman in her 50s with the bearing of someone who had survived corporate boardrooms and emerged stronger. At 42, Jennifer Park occupied the chair to Victoria's left, her nervous energy offset by an intelligence that sparkled when she discussed legal strategy. So you are telling me, Carol said, stirring sugar into her coffee with precise movements, that Richard Morrison used the exact same playbook on you that he used on me 15 years ago. Victoria nodded. The financial surveillance, the gaslighting, the systematic isolation from family and friends, even some of the same phrases about women not understanding business complexities. Jennifer, who had dated Richard briefly before his marriage to Victoria, spoke with the slight stutter that appeared when she was nervous, but disappeared entirely when she was angry. He told me I was too emotional to understand his investment strategies. Then I found out he was using my name to open accounts I never authorized. That is his pattern, Carol explained. Financial abuse disguised as protecting women from their own supposed ignorance. He did the same thing to my business partner's wife until she finally left him and took half his assets in divorce court. Victoria felt a mixture of validation and horror. How many women has he done this to? More than we know about, I suspect, Carol replied. Men like Richard do not suddenly develop these behaviors in middle age. They refine them over decades of practice. The coffee shop's afternoon crowd provided cover for their conversation, but Victoria still found herself glancing toward the door every few minutes. 2 weeks of freedom from Richard's surveillance had not been enough to break the hypervigilance that years of psychological abuse had created. Victoria, Jennifer said gently, you keep checking the exits like he might show up here. Is he stalking you? Not directly, but he has been showing up places where he knows I might be. My doctor's office, the grocery store near my sister's apartment, the courthouse where I filed the restraining order paperwork. Carol's expression hardened. That is intimidation tactics. He wants you to feel like you cannot escape his presence, even when you are legally protected from direct contact. It is working, Victoria admitted. I feel like I am always looking over my shoulder, always waiting for him to appear and create some kind of scene. That is exactly what he wants, Jennifer said, her voice gaining strength as her anger overcame her nervousness. He wants you to feel powerless even when you are actually in control of the legal process. Victoria's phone buzzed with a text message, and she glanced at it automatically. The number was blocked, but the message made her blood run cold. Having coffee with my fan club. How quaint. Say hello to Carol and Jennifer for me. Her hands began shaking as she showed the message to the other women. Son of a bitch, Carol muttered. He is having you followed. Jennifer looked around the coffee shop with new awareness. Do you see anyone who might be watching us? It does not matter who, Carol said grimly. What matters is that Richard is escalating his harassment. This is not just intimidation anymore. This is evidence of continued psychological abuse in violation of the restraining order. Victoria felt panic rising in her throat. What if he tries to use this against me? What if he claims I am building some kind of conspiracy against him? Then he will have to explain why he is monitoring your private conversations and movements, Jennifer replied, pulling out her phone. I am calling your lawyer right now. As Jennifer dialed Margaret Williams's number, Victoria found herself studying the faces of strangers in the coffee shop, wondering which one might be reporting back to Richard. The feeling of being watched, of having her every movement monitored and judged, brought back all the anxiety she had lived with during her marriage. This is why he does it, Carol said quietly, reading Victoria's expression. Not just to gather information, but to make you feel like you can never truly escape him, like he will always be watching, always be in control. It is working, Victoria whispered. Only if you let it work, Carol replied firmly. Victoria, I need you to listen to me. I went through this exact same thing with my ex-husband 12 years ago. The surveillance, the intimidation, the feeling like I could never have a private conversation or a moment of peace. How did you make it stop? By refusing to be controlled by it, by documenting every violation of the restraining order and using each one to build a stronger legal case, by turning his own tactics against him. Jennifer finished her call to Margaret and looked grim. Your lawyer wants to see that text message immediately. She said this could be grounds for additional criminal charges related to stalking and violation of protective orders. Victoria felt a spark of hope mixed with determination. You mean his surveillance could actually help our case? Absolutely, as Carol said. Every time Richard violates the boundaries established by the court, he provides more evidence of his inability to respect legal authority. Judges do not like men who think they are above restraining orders. Plus, Jennifer added, This text message proves he has been monitoring your movements and associations. That supports the argument that his behavior constitutes organized harassment rather than isolated incidents. As if summoned by their conversation, Victoria's phone rang. Margaret Williams' number appeared on the screen. Victoria, I just reviewed the text message Jennifer forwarded to me. Margaret's voice was crisp with professional anger. We are filing contempt of court charges this afternoon. Richard has clearly violated the restraining order by monitoring your location and contacting you indirectly. What does that mean for our case? It means Richard Morrison is proving our allegations about his controlling and abusive behavior better than we ever could ourselves. Judges tend to take a dim view of men who cannot follow simple court orders about leaving their estranged wives alone. Victoria felt some of her anxiety transforming into something more useful, righteous anger. Margaret, I want to file formal complaints about every incident of surveillance and intimidation. All of it. Excellent. Can you and your companions come to my office this afternoon? I would like to interview Carol and Jennifer about their experiences with Richard. Their testimony could establish a pattern of behavior that strengthens your case significantly. After hanging up, Victoria looked at the two women who had become unlikely allies in her fight against Richard's abuse. Are you both willing to testify about what he did to you? Carol smiled grimly. Victoria, I have been waiting 15 years for the chance to make Richard Morrison face consequences for his behavior. You just gave me that opportunity. Jennifer nodded, her stutter completely gone now that her anger had taken over. I want every woman in this city to know what kind of man Richard Morrison really is. Let him try to explain away 3 different women with identical stories about financial abuse and psychological manipulation. Victoria felt something she had not experienced since childhood, the power of women supporting women against a common threat. For years, Richard had isolated her from other women, convinced her that she was the problem, made her believe she was the only one struggling with his behavior. You know what I realize, Victoria said, looking at her unexpected allies. Richard made a crucial mistake when he threw me out that night. What is that? Carol asked. He assumed I would stay isolated and ashamed, that I would try to handle this alone like I had handled everything else in our marriage. He never considered that other women might be willing to stand up and tell their own stories about what he did to them. Jennifer grinned. Men like Richard always underestimate women's willingness to support each other once they realize they are not alone. Plus, Carol added, he never considered that his pattern of abuse would eventually create its own evidence trail. Every woman he manipulated is a potential witness against him. Victoria's phone buzzed again with another blocked number, but this time she did not feel afraid. Instead, she screenshot the message and forwarded it directly to Margaret Williams before reading it aloud to Carol and Jennifer. Still building your little support group. How pathetic. Do you really think anyone will believe 3 bitter women over a successful businessman? Carol laughed. Oh, Richard, you just keep making this easier for us. Should we respond? Jennifer asked. Victoria thought for a moment, then typed a single message back, see you in court. As they left the coffee shop together, Victoria realized that Richard's surveillance had backfired completely. Instead of making her feel isolated and vulnerable, it had helped her understand that she was part of a community of survivors who were ready to fight back. Ladies, she said as they walked toward Margaret's office, let us go destroy a millionaire ex-husband's reputation. With pleasure, Carol replied. About time, Jennifer added. For the first time since her marriage began, Victoria felt the power of women supporting women, and she knew Richard Morrison had no idea what was coming for him. Meanwhile, as news vans gathered outside the Morrison mansion in Westchester County, Richard Morrison stood in his home office surrounded by legal documents and damage control strategies that were failing faster than he could implement them. His high-priced legal team had spread files across every surface, but their expressions suggested they were fighting a losing battle. Richard, we need to discuss settlement options, said his lead attorney, James Crawford, a man whose expensive suits could not disguise his growing nervousness about the case. The evidence your wife's team has compiled is extensive. Settlement is not an option, Richard replied, his voice carrying the cold authority that had intimidated business rivals for 2 decades. Victoria is bluffing. She does not have the resources or the resolve to sustain a prolonged legal battle. Actually, she does, Crawford said grimly, consulting his notes. Her sister's tech company is funding the litigation, and Margaret Williams has a reputation for taking complex abuse cases to trial even when defendants have unlimited resources. Through the office windows, Richard could see reporters setting up equipment on the public sidewalk outside his gates. The story had leaked to the media 3 days ago, and already his carefully cultivated image as a successful philanthropist was crumbling under headlines about tech executive accused of endangering pregnant wife. The media coverage is becoming a problem, Crawford continued. Your business partners are asking questions, and the board of directors wants to schedule an emergency meeting about potential liability issues. Richard felt control slipping through his fingers like water. For 18 months, he had orchestrated every detail of his exit strategy from the marriage. The offshore accounts, the asset transfers, the documentation of Victoria's supposed emotional instability, all of it had been designed to protect his wealth and reputation while discarding an increasingly inconvenient wife. He had not anticipated Victoria fighting back with competent legal representation and corroborating witnesses. What about the private investigators? Richard asked. Do we have anything we can use to discredit her? Crawford shifted uncomfortably. Richard, the surveillance you ordered may have violated restraining order provisions. Our investigators found evidence of Victoria meeting with other women, but using that information could expose you to additional criminal charges for stalking. Other women. Women who claim to have had similar experiences with you in past relationships? Margaret Williams is building a pattern of behavior case that could be very damaging. Richard felt a familiar rage building in his chest, the same fury that had driven him to throw Victoria out in the storm. How dare she recruit other women to support her lies? How dare she turn his previous relationships into weapons against him? Carol Henderson and Jennifer Park. Crawford continued, reading from his file. Both are willing to testify about financial manipulation and psychological abuse, combined with Elena Rodriguez's documentation of incidents during your marriage. The prosecution has a very strong case for establishing systematic abusive behavior. Elena was paid to be loyal to this family. Elena was paid to be a housekeeper, not to enable domestic abuse. Her testimony about what she witnessed could be devastating, especially given the detailed records she kept. Richard walked to his window and stared out at the media circus developing outside his gates. 24 hours ago, he had been Richard Morrison, successful tech executive and respected community leader. Now he was becoming a cautionary tale about powerful men who thought they could abuse women without consequences. What are our options? He asked finally. Realistically, negotiate the best possible settlement and hope Victoria's team agrees to a non-disclosure provision. If this goes to trial, you could face criminal conviction for endangerment, civil liability for financial abuse, and complete destruction of your professional reputation. Criminal conviction? Crawford nodded soberly. Forcing a pregnant woman out of her home during a dangerous storm meets the legal definition of reckless endangerment. Add in the illegal surveillance and potential financial fraud, and you could be looking at significant jail time. Richard felt his carefully constructed world collapsing around him. Everything he had built, his company, his reputation, his wealth, was suddenly at risk because his wife had refused to disappear quietly into the night. There has to be another way, he said. Richard, I have been practicing criminal defense for 25 years. I have seen cases like this before. Wealthy men who think their money makes them untouchable, who believe they can manipulate the legal system the same way they manipulate everything else in their lives. Crawford's voice carried a warning. The ones who accept responsibility early and make reasonable settlements survive with some dignity intact. The ones who fight dirty thinking they can win through intimidation and character assassination end up losing everything. Are you saying I should just give Victoria whatever she wants? I am saying you should recognize that what Victoria wants is justice, not revenge. There is a difference, and understanding that difference could save your life as you know it. Richard turned away from the window, his mind racing through alternatives. Perhaps he could convince Cassandra to provide an alibi for the night of the storm. Perhaps his business contacts could pressure Victoria's legal team through their own networks. Perhaps there was still a way to turn this situation to his advantage. What if we can prove Victoria was planning to leave the marriage anyway? What if we can show she engineered this whole situation to maximize her financial settlement? Crawford looked at him with something approaching pity. Richard, do you hear yourself? You are suggesting that your 6 months pregnant wife orchestrated her own endangerment during a severe storm in order to create grounds for a lawsuit? Do you understand how that sounds? It sounds like the truth. It sounds like the desperate theory of a man who cannot accept that his actions have consequences. Crawford closed his file and stood up. Richard, I am going to give you some advice as both your attorney and as someone who has watched too many men destroy themselves through arrogance. Apologize. Accept responsibility. Offer a fair settlement. Do it now, before this case goes to trial and takes everything you have worked for. And if I refuse, then I will continue to represent you to the best of my ability, but I will also begin preparing for the likelihood that Richard Morrison will become a case study in how not to handle domestic abuse allegations. After Crawford left, Richard sat alone in his office, surrounded by the expensive trappings of his success. Original artwork, awards from business organizations, photographs of himself with politicians and celebrities, all of it suddenly felt hollow and fragile. His phone rang, and Cassandra's name appeared on the screen. Richard, darling, I saw the news reports. This is just awful publicity for your company. It is temporary, Richard said, though his voice lacked conviction. Victoria's overplaying her hand. When people see the truth about her behavior. Actually, Richard, I have been thinking about our relationship, and with all this negative attention, Cassandra's voice carried a careful distance that Richard recognized from his own conversations when he was discarding people who had become inconvenient. Cassandra, you cannot be serious. I think we should take a break until this legal situation resolves itself. I have my own reputation to consider. The line went dead, and Richard realized that even his escape route from the marriage was abandoning him. Cassandra, who had seemed so eager to share his wealth and status, was now protecting herself from association with his disgrace. He thought about Victoria, probably sitting in Margaret Williams's office, planning the next phase of their legal strategy. Victoria, who had seemed so broken and compliant just weeks ago, had somehow found the strength to fight back against everything he had put her through. For the first time since the confrontation began, Richard Morrison felt genuinely afraid, not of the legal consequences or the financial losses, but of the possibility that he had finally encountered a problem that money and intimidation could not solve. A problem named Victoria Chen Morrison, who had decided that she was worth fighting for. The next morning, outside the courthouse steps, a crowd of reporters and cameramen jostled for position as Margaret Williams led Victoria through the media gauntlet. Victoria wore a navy blue maternity dress that projected both vulnerability and strength, her 7-month pregnancy now visible proof of the endangerment charges at the heart of their case. Mrs. Morrison, how do you feel about facing your husband in court today? Shouted a reporter from Channel 7 News. Victoria paused at the courthouse entrance, flanked by Margaret and Sarah, and spoke directly into the cameras with a clarity that surprised even herself. I feel ready to tell the truth about what Richard Morrison did to me and our unborn daughter. No woman should have to endure what I endured, and no child should grow up thinking that kind of behavior is acceptable. Inside the packed courtroom, tension filled the air, like electricity before a storm. Richard sat at the defendant's table in his most expensive suit, projecting the confidence of a man accustomed to winning. But Victoria noticed the strain around his eyes and the way his hands clenched and unclenched on the table's surface. Judge Patricia Hernandez entered with the bearing of someone who had presided over too many cases involving powerful men who thought they were above the law. At 62, she had a reputation for fairness balanced with zero tolerance for domestic abuse in any form. This court is now in session, Judge Hernandez announced. We are here today to consider charges of criminal endangerment, financial abuse, and violation of protective orders against the defendant, Richard Morrison, Margaret Williams rose for her opening statement, her voice carrying the authority of 3 decades fighting for abused women. Your Honor, the evidence will show that Richard Morrison engaged in a systematic campaign of psychological and financial abuse against his pregnant wife, culminating in an act of criminal endangerment that could have resulted in the death of both mother and child. She walked to the jury box, making eye contact with each of the 12 jurors who would decide Richard's fate. Richard Morrison is a millionaire ex-husband who believed his wealth gave him the right to treat women as disposable property. When his wife began asking questions about financial irregularities in their marriage, he responded not with honesty, but with escalating abuse designed to silence her forever. Richard's attorney, James Crawford, stood for the defense's opening statement, his expensive suit and practiced demeanor projecting confidence that felt increasingly hollow in the face of the prosecution's evidence. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, my client, Richard Morrison, is a successful businessman who built a $50 million company through hard work and innovation. What we have here is an unfortunate marital dispute that has been blown out of proportion by a woman seeking to maximize her financial gain through false accusations. Victoria watched the jury's faces as Crawford spoke, noting their skeptical expressions when he described her pregnancy as convenient timing and her accusations as calculated manipulation. The prosecution would have you believe that Mr. Morrison is some kind of criminal mastermind who orchestrated an elaborate scheme to harm his wife. The truth is far simpler. Victoria Morrison is an intelligent woman who saw an opportunity to turn marital problems into financial advantage. Margaret's redirect was swift and devastating. If Mrs. Morrison was truly seeking financial advantage, why did she refuse multiple settlement offers that would have made her wealthy while keeping these allegations private? If she was manipulating the situation, why did she risk her own safety and her baby's life by driving in a dangerous storm instead of staying comfortable in a mansion? The first witness called was Elena Rodriguez, who entered the courtroom wearing her best dress and carrying herself with quiet dignity. Her voice was soft but steady as she was sworn in. Mrs. Rodriguez, Margaret began, how long did you work for the Morrison family? 12 years since before Senor Morrison married Victoria. During that time, did you observe Mr. Morrison's treatment of his wife? Elena's eyes found Victoria's across the courtroom. See, I watched him change from a man who treated her with respect to someone who made her afraid in her own home. Can you give the court specific examples? Elena pulled out a small notebook, her hands trembling slightly. I wrote down things I saw because my daughter told me to document everything in case there was trouble. Crawford objected. Hearsay, Your Honor. The witness cannot testify about conversations with third parties. Sustained, but the witness may testify about her own observations. Judge Hernandez ruled. Elena opened her notebook. March 15th, this year, Senor Morrison screamed at Senora Victoria for leaving dishes in the sink. He called her worthless and lazy. She was pregnant and having morning sickness, but she could not tell him because he became angry when she was sick. Did you witness the incident that led to Mrs. Morrison leaving the house on the night of the storm? See? Elena's voice grew stronger with anger. Senor Morrison told her to pack her bags. He said she had 30 minutes. The storm was very bad, with flood warnings on the television. I begged him to let her stay until morning, but he said the storm could have her. Crawford's cross-examination was aggressive, but ultimately ineffective. Mrs. Rodriguez, isn't it true that you were paid by Mr. Morrison for 12 years? Isn't it possible your loyalty to Mrs. Morrison is affecting your memory of these events? Elena straightened in her chair. Sir, I remember everything exactly as it happened because I was afraid someone would be hurt. When you see a man throwing his pregnant wife out in a dangerous storm, you do not forget that. But you continued working for Mr. Morrison after this alleged incident. Because I needed to feed my family, Elena replied firmly. That does not make what I saw less true. Sarah Chen took the stand next, her tech entrepreneur confidence filling the courtroom as she presented the financial evidence with devastating precision. The defendant systematically moved $18 million in marital assets to offshore accounts over an 8-month period, Sarah testified, pulling up financial records on the courtroom's display screen. These transfers coincided exactly with my sister's prenatal appointments, showing deliberate timing to avoid detection. In your professional opinion, was this normal financial planning or deliberate concealment? This was financial abuse designed to impoverish my sister while she was pregnant and vulnerable. No legitimate business purpose explains this pattern of asset movement. Crawford's attempts to discredit Sarah's technical expertise fell flat when she calmly explained her credentials in forensic accounting and her company's work with federal agencies investigating financial crimes. Carol Henderson's testimony established the pattern of behavior that Margaret had been building toward. Richard Morrison used identical tactics against me 15 years ago, Carol testified with the authority of a woman who had survived and thrived after abuse. Financial surveillance, gaslighting, isolation from family and friends. The only difference was that I wasn't pregnant when he decided to discard me. Did Mr. Morrison ever explain his reasons for the financial manipulation? He said women couldn't understand complex business decisions and that he was protecting me from my own ignorance. Later, I discovered he was preparing to leave the relationship while keeping all the assets we had built together. Jennifer Park's testimony, delivered without her usual stutter because anger had burned away her nervousness, provided additional confirmation of Richard's methods. He told me I was too emotional to understand investments, then used my personal information to open accounts I never authorized. When I confronted him, he said I was being paranoid and suspicious. When Victoria finally took the stand, the courtroom fell completely silent. Her voice was steady as she began her testimony, 7 months pregnant and radiating the strength she had discovered during the legal battle. Your Honor, on the night of September 15th, my husband threw me out of our home into a dangerous storm, knowing I was 6 months pregnant with a high-risk pregnancy. Margaret guided her through the events of that night, letting Victoria tell her story in her own words without interruption. Richard found a text message from his mistress and accused me of spying on him. When I asked about our finances, he said I was being greedy and calculating. He gave me 30 minutes to pack whatever I could carry. What were the weather conditions that night? Severe storm warnings, flooding, wind gusts over 60 miles per hour. The news was telling people to stay indoors, but Richard said the storm could have me for all he cared. Were you afraid, terrified, not just for myself, but for our baby? I knew driving in those conditions was dangerous, but staying felt even more dangerous. Crawford's cross-examination was brutal. As expected, he attacked Victoria's motives, her timeline, her decision to drive in the storm, and her relationship with her sister and legal team. Mrs. Morrison, isn't it true that you had already consulted with divorce attorneys before the night in question? I had asked my sister about our financial situation because things didn't make sense to me. That's not the same as planning a divorce. But you were planning to leave the marriage for financial gain. Victoria looked directly at Richard as she answered. I was planning to understand why my husband was hiding money from me and treating me like an enemy instead of his wife. The most damaging moment came when Crawford tried to suggest that Victoria had engineered the confrontation for legal advantage. Isn't it convenient that you had witnesses to your husband's alleged behavior? Sir, Victoria replied with quiet strength, there is nothing convenient about being thrown out of your home while pregnant during a storm. There is nothing convenient about having your life destroyed by someone who promised to love and protect you. Crawford's final question backfired spectacularly. Mrs. Morrison, if your husband was truly as abusive as you claim, why did you stay married to him for 8 years? Victoria's answer silenced the entire courtroom. Because men like Richard Morrison are experts at making women believe that we deserve the treatment we receive. Because he convinced me that questioning him was disloyal, that asking for honesty was greedy, that expecting basic respect was unrealistic. Because it took me 8 years to understand that love should never require you to make yourself smaller. Richard's testimony was a disaster from the moment he took the stand. His arrogance and sense of entitlement came through clearly as he dismissed his wife's concerns as emotional overreactions and described his financial maneuvers as protecting assets from unreasonable claims. Mr. Morrison, Margaret asked during cross-examination, do you believe you had the right to force your pregnant wife out of her home during a dangerous storm? I told Victoria she could stay if she signed the separation papers. She chose to leave. You gave a pregnant woman an ultimatum: sign away her rights or face a dangerous storm. I gave her options. She made her choice. Mr. Morrison, do you love your wife? The question hung in the air for a long moment. Richard's answer would haunt him for the rest of his life. Love is a luxury I cannot afford when someone is trying to destroy everything I have built. Margaret's closing argument was devastating in its simplicity. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard Morrison just told you everything you need to know about his character. He cannot afford love, but he can afford offshore accounts, private investigators, and surveillance equipment to spy on his pregnant wife. He cannot afford compassion, but he can afford lawyers to help him hide marital assets. He cannot afford basic human decency, but he can afford to throw a pregnant woman out in a storm because she dared to ask questions about their finances. This case is not complicated. A powerful man decided his wife had become inconvenient, so he tried to dispose of her like she was worthless property. The only thing that saved Victoria Morrison was her own strength and the courage of people like Elena Rodriguez, who refused to look the other way. Crawford's closing argument fell flat as he continued to characterize Victoria as a calculating manipulator, an argument the jury clearly rejected based on the evidence they had heard. The evidence shows that Victoria Morrison is an intelligent woman who recognized abuse and found the courage to escape it. If that makes her calculating, then every abused woman who fights back is guilty of calculation. If that makes her manipulative, then every victim who refuses to stay silent is guilty of manipulation. After 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. Judge Hernandez read each count with deliberate gravity. On the charge of criminal endangerment, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of financial abuse, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of violation of protective orders, we find the defendant guilty. The civil damages were equally devastating: $8 million in compensatory damages, $12 million in punitive damages, and full restoration of all hidden assets to the marital estate. Richard's face went completely white as the verdicts were read. His carefully constructed world had collapsed in a single afternoon, brought down by the testimony of women he had dismissed as powerless. Victoria felt her daughter kick as the judge dismissed the court, and she placed her hands on her belly with a smile. "You hear that, little one?" she whispered. "Justice." After 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned to a packed courtroom where tension hung thick as summer air. Victoria sat beside Margaret Williams, her hands resting protectively on her 7-month pregnant belly, while Richard Morrison maintained his businessman's posture at the defendant's table, despite the pale strain around his eyes. Judge Hernandez received the verdict forms and reviewed them carefully before addressing the court. "Has the jury reached a verdict on all counts?" The jury foreman, a middle-aged teacher named Robert Martinez, stood with obvious gravity. "We have, Your Honor. On the charge of criminal endangerment of a pregnant woman, how do you find we find the defendant guilty?" Victoria felt Sarah's hand squeeze hers as the first victory settled over them, like warm sunlight. "On the charge of financial abuse and fraudulent concealment of marital assets, how do you find we find the defendant guilty?" Margaret's satisfied smile was barely visible, but Victoria caught it from the corner of her eye. "On the charge of violation of protective court orders through surveillance and indirect contact, how do you find we find the defendant guilty?" Richard's expensive attorney, James Crawford, visibly deflated as each guilty verdict stripped away another layer of his client's carefully constructed defense. Judge Hernandez continued to the civil claims. "On the matter of compensatory damages for emotional distress and endangerment, we award the plaintiff $8 million. Victoria's eyes widened. She had hoped for justice, but the financial validation of her suffering felt surreal. "On the matter of punitive damages designed to deter similar behavior, we award the plaintiff $12 million. A murmur ran through the courtroom gallery, where reporters scribbled frantically, and Richard's business associates shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Finally, on the matter of restoration of concealed marital assets, we order full restoration of all hidden funds and properties to the marital estate, totaling approximately $18 million. Victoria heard Richard's sharp intake of breath behind her. In a single afternoon, the jury had stripped him of nearly $40 million and established legal precedent that his behavior constituted serious criminal activity. Judge Hernandez addressed Richard directly. Mr. Morrison, you have been found guilty of criminal charges that carry potential jail time, given the severity of financial abuse involved and the endangerment of a pregnant woman. I am sentencing you to 18 months in minimum security prison, suspended pending completion of court-ordered counseling for domestic abuse perpetrators. Additionally, you are permanently banned from any direct or indirect contact with the plaintiff except through court-approved channels related to child custody. Violation of this order will result in immediate imprisonment. Richard stood slowly, his composure finally cracking as the weight of consequences settled on his shoulders. The man who had controlled every aspect of Victoria's life for 8 years now faced restrictions on his own freedom that money could not buy his way out of. As court dismissed, reporters surged forward, but Margaret skillfully guided Victoria toward a side exit where Sarah waited with the car. "How do you feel?" Sarah asked as they drove away from the courthouse. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, processing the magnitude of what had just happened. "Free?" she said finally. "For the first time in 8 years, I feel completely free." Her phone buzzed with messages from news outlets requesting interviews, but also with texts from women she had never met thanking her for taking Richard to court. Apparently, the trial coverage had inspired other victims of financial abuse to come forward with their own stories. "Look at this," Sarah said, scrolling through social media on her tablet. "The hashtag Millionaire accountability is trending. Women are sharing their own stories about financial abuse and narcissistic partners." Victoria read over her sister's shoulder, seeing message after message from women who recognized their own experiences in her testimony. "I never thought about it becoming bigger than just my case. That is what happens when someone stands up to a system that protects powerful men," Margaret said from the front passenger seat. "Your courage gave other women permission to speak their truth." The next few days brought an avalanche of consequences for Richard Morrison that extended far beyond the courtroom. His tech company's board of directors voted to remove him as CEO, citing conduct incompatible with corporate values and fiduciary responsibilities. His business partners began liquidating joint ventures to distance themselves from the scandal. The charitable organizations where he had served on boards quietly removed his name from their leadership lists. Most damaging of all, federal investigators announced they were reviewing Richard's offshore financial structures for potential tax evasion and securities fraud. The case Victoria had brought for personal justice was now expanding into a broader examination of white-collar crime. "He built his whole identity around being untouchable," Sarah observed as they watched the news coverage from Victoria's new apartment in Manhattan. "Now he is finding out that money only protects you until someone with more courage than fear decides to hold you accountable." Victoria had used part of her settlement to purchase a spacious 2-bedroom apartment with a nursery overlooking Central Park. Elena Rodriguez had left Richard's employment the day after the verdict and now worked for Victoria as a live-in nanny and housekeeper. Finally free to speak openly about the abuse she had witnessed. "Senora Victoria," Elena said, bringing tea and homemade cookies to where the sisters sat planning Victoria's foundation for women escaping financial abuse. "I have something to tell you." "What is it?" "Elena, 3 women called today. They heard about the case on the news and want to know if you can help them understand their legal rights. Their husbands are doing the same thing Senor Morrison did to you." Victoria felt her daughter kick, as if responding to the possibility of helping other families avoid the trauma they had endured. "Tell them to call Margaret Williams' office," Victoria said, "and tell them that if they cannot afford legal representation, my foundation will cover their costs." Sarah grinned. "My sister, the crusader for justice. My sister, the woman who finally found her voice," Victoria replied. 6 months later, as Victoria held her healthy daughter for the first time, surrounded by Sarah, Elena, Margaret, and the close friends who had supported her through the legal battle, she reflected on the transformation that had begun with Richard's cruelty in a storm. "What are you going to name her?" Sarah asked, stroking the baby's tiny hand. Victoria looked down at her daughter's perfect face and thought about all the women who had supported her journey from victim to victor. "Hope," she said simply. "Her name is Hope Morrison Chen." "Hope Morrison Chen," Elena repeated softly. "A name for a new generation." Outside the hospital window, storm clouds gathered over the city, but Victoria no longer felt afraid of storms. She had learned that the strongest storms often clear the air and make space for new growth. Richard Morrison was serving his suspended sentence in court-ordered counseling while his financial empire continued crumbling under federal investigation. He would never again have the power to terrorize women with his wealth and connections. Victoria's foundation had already helped 12 women escape financially abusive relationships, providing legal support, temporary housing, and financial education to help them rebuild their lives. Margaret Williams had agreed to serve as the foundation's legal director, and Sarah had developed an app that helped women document financial abuse and connect with resources. "You know what I learned," Victoria said, settling baby Hope against her chest. "Strength is not about never falling down. Strength is about getting back up and helping others do the same." Elena smiled, remembering similar words she had spoken to Victoria during the darkest days of her marriage. "See, mija, and now you teach that strength to your daughter." Victoria looked at Hope's sleeping face and made a silent promise. Her daughter would grow up knowing her worth, surrounded by women who supported each other. In a world where powerful men face consequences for abusing the people they claim to love, the millionaire ex-husband who had tried to destroy them both was now a cautionary tale. While Victoria Morrison Chen had become something more powerful than Richard had ever been, a woman who refused to be silenced, surrounded by a community of other women who had found their voices through her courage. Hope stirred in her arms and opened her eyes, looking directly at her mother with the clear gaze of someone who would never doubt her own value. "Hello, beautiful girl," Victoria whispered. "Welcome to a world where women support women." 6 months later, in a cozy nursery filled with afternoon sunlight streaming through windows overlooking Central Park, Victoria sat in a rocking chair, feeding baby Hope, while Elena folded tiny clothes nearby. The peaceful domesticity of the scene would have been impossible to imagine during the chaos of the legal battle, but it felt natural now, like coming home after a long journey through darkness. "She has your eyes," Elena observed, watching Hope's intent focus as she nursed. "But your sister's stubborn chin," Victoria laughed softly. "God help us all if she inherits Sarah's determination along with everything else." "The world needs more determined women," Elena replied, "especially after seeing what you accomplished." The foundation Victoria had established with her settlement money had grown beyond anything she had imagined. What began as a desire to help a few women had evolved into a comprehensive program providing legal support, financial education, and transitional housing for women escaping economically abusive relationships. "The applications came in today," Victoria said, gesturing toward a stack of folders on the changing table. 43 women requesting assistance this month alone. 43 women who found courage because you showed them it was possible to fight back," Elena pointed out. "That is your real victory, not the money or the headlines." The headlines had continued for months after the trial, as federal investigators uncovered the full scope of Richard's financial crimes. His offshore accounts had hidden not just marital assets, but also money diverted from client funds and corporate accounts. What had begun as a domestic abuse case had mushroomed into a federal investigation of white-collar crime that ultimately sent Richard to federal prison for 5 years. Victoria felt no satisfaction in his imprisonment, only relief that he could no longer harm other women the way he had harmed her. She had learned the difference between justice and revenge. Justice protected future victims, while revenge only perpetuated cycles of pain. "Mrs. Morrison Chen," a soft voice interrupted her thoughts. "I am sorry to bother you during your time with the baby." Victoria looked up to see a young woman standing hesitantly in the nursery doorway. She was perhaps 25, with the careful posture of someone who had learned to make herself small to avoid attracting dangerous attention. "Please come in," Victoria said warmly, "and call me Victoria. You must be Jessica." Jessica nodded, stepping carefully into the room like she was entering a sacred space. "Margaret Williams said you might be willing to talk with me about my situation." Victoria had been meeting with women seeking help for months now, but each story still broke her heart while simultaneously reinforcing her commitment to the work. Jessica's story would be both familiar and unique, like all stories of abuse. "Tell me what brought you here," Victoria said gently, settling hope against her shoulder to free her hands for conversation. "My husband controls all our money," Jessica began, her voice barely above a whisper. "He says I am too stupid to understand finances, but I think he is hiding things from me. When I ask questions, he says I am being paranoid and ungrateful." Elena quietly excused herself, recognizing the need for privacy, but not before bringing Jessica a cup of tea and a reassuring smile. "How long has this been going on?" Victoria asked. 3 years, since we got married, but it has gotten worse since I started working again. He wants me to quit my job, says we do not need my income, but then he controls every penny I spend." Victoria nodded, recognizing the classic pattern of isolation and financial control. "Jessica, what you are describing is called financial abuse, and it is a serious crime. You are not paranoid, and you are definitely not stupid." Jessica's eyes filled with tears. "But he never hits me. He says I should be grateful because he provides for me, and compared to women who get beaten..." "Abuse does not have to be physical to be real," Victoria said firmly. "Psychological abuse and financial control can be just as damaging as physical violence, sometimes more so because it is harder to recognize and harder to prove." Hope stirred against Victoria's shoulder, making the small, contented sounds of a well-fed baby. The contrast between the peace of new life and the pain of Jessica's situation reminded Victoria why this work mattered so much. "I brought some documents," Jessica said, pulling a manila folder from her purse. "Bank statements I found hidden in his office. I do not understand all of it, but something seems wrong." Victoria reviewed the papers while Jessica watched anxiously. Even with limited financial training, she could see irregularities that suggested hidden accounts and diverted funds. "Jessica, these documents show your husband has been moving money to accounts you do not have access to. That is illegal in most states when done without spousal consent." "Really? But he said it was normal financial planning." "It is financial abuse disguised as financial planning. The same tactics my ex-husband used." Victoria handed the documents back. "Jessica, would you be willing to work with our legal team to understand your full financial picture? I cannot afford lawyers. Our foundation covers all legal costs for women in situations like yours. Margaret Williams, who represented me, leads our legal team now. She has helped dozens of women recover hidden assets and gain financial independence." Jessica's shoulders sagged with relief. "I was so afraid I was crazy, that I was making problems where none existed. That is exactly what financial abusers want you to think. They gaslight you into questioning your own perceptions so you will stop asking inconvenient questions." Victoria thought about her own journey from confusion and self-doubt to clarity and empowerment. "Jessica, can I tell you something I wish someone had told me years ago? Please, your instincts are right. If something feels wrong with your finances, if your husband's explanations do not make sense, if you feel like you are being lied to or manipulated, trust those feelings. Women's intuition about these things is usually accurate. But what if I am wrong? What if I destroy my marriage over a misunderstanding?" Victoria looked down at Hope's peaceful face, thinking about the world she wanted her daughter to inherit. "Jessica, a marriage that cannot survive honest questions about shared finances is not a marriage worth preserving. A husband who reacts to reasonable inquiries with anger and accusations is not a husband worthy of your loyalty." "I am scared," Jessica admitted. "He controls our house, our cars, our credit cards. If I challenge him and he throws me out, then you come here, Victoria said simply. We have transitional housing for women leaving financially abusive relationships. We help with legal representation, job training, financial education, and emotional support. You will not face this alone. Jessica wiped her eyes with the tissue Elena had thoughtfully provided. How do you do this? How do you listen to stories like mine over and over without getting discouraged? Victoria considered the question seriously. Because every woman who finds the courage to leave an abusive situation makes it easier for the next woman to recognize her own situation and seek help. Because my daughter will grow up in a world where more women know their worth and fewer men think they can abuse women without consequences. Plus, Victoria added with a smile, every Richard Morrison who faces legal consequences for financial abuse sends a message to other would-be abusers that there are costs to treating women like property. What happened to your ex-husband? He is in federal prison for financial fraud, and his business empire collapsed completely. He went from being a respected millionaire ex-husband to being a cautionary tale about the consequences of narcissistic abuse. Jessica's eyes widened. Prison. 5 years. It turns out that men who commit financial abuse against their wives often commit financial crimes against other people as well. Once investigators started looking closely at Richard's business practices, they found evidence of much broader criminal activity. Do you think I think your husband has made the same mistake Richard made, underestimating the intelligence and determination of the woman he chose to abuse. Hope began fussing, and Victoria stood to walk her around the sunny nursery. Jessica, I want you to meet with Margaret Williams this week. Will you do that? Yes. Thank you. I cannot believe how different I feel just from this one conversation. That is the power of being believed instead of gaslit, of having your perceptions validated instead of dismissed. It is amazing how quickly clarity returns when you are not constantly being told that your reality is wrong. After Jessica left with Margaret's contact information and a folder of resources, Victoria sat back down in the rocking chair with hope and thought about the transformation her life had undergone in just 18 months. She had gone from being an isolated, financially dependent wife to becoming an advocate for women's economic rights. She had discovered strengths she never knew she possessed and built a community of support she had never imagined possible. Most importantly, she had created a safe, loving environment for her daughter to grow up in, surrounded by women who supported each other and men who treated women with genuine respect. What do you think? Hope, Victoria asked her sleeping daughter. Ready to help change the world. Hope stirred and opened her eyes, looking directly at her mother with the clear, untroubled gaze of someone who had never known anything but love and security. Elena appeared in the doorway with the afternoon mail. Senora Victoria, you have a letter from the governor's office. Victoria opened the official envelope and read the contents with growing amazement. They want me to serve on a state commission examining financial abuse in domestic relationships. They want to use our foundation's work as a model for statewide programs. Of course they do, Elena said with satisfaction. You started something important here. Now it grows bigger than any of us imagined. Victoria looked around the nursery, with its soft colors and afternoon sunshine, its shelves of books waiting for Hope to grow old enough to read, its sense of peace and possibility. A year ago, she had been thrown out of a mansion in a storm, pregnant and terrified. Now she was holding her healthy daughter in their own home, surrounded by meaningful work and genuine relationships. You know what I realized, Elena? Some storms destroy everything, but the strongest storms clear away what was never meant to last and make space for what belongs. Elena smiled, remembering the frightened woman who had left the Morrison mansion in the rain and recognizing the powerful advocate she had become. See, mija, and now you teach other women to dance in the rain instead of just surviving the storm. Victoria kissed Hope's forehead and looked out the window at Central Park, where families walked together in the afternoon sunshine. Somewhere out there, women were discovering their own strength, finding their own voices, building their own communities of support. The millionaire ex-husband who had tried to destroy them both was now just a memory, a cautionary tale, a reminder of what was possible when women refused to accept unacceptable treatment. Hope Morrison Chen would grow up in a world where that refusal was not remarkable but routine, where women supporting women was not revolutionary but expected, where financial independence was not a luxury but a right. "Sleep well, beautiful girl," Victoria whispered as Hope's eyes drifted closed. "Tomorrow we continue changing the world." Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, but Victoria no longer feared the thunder. She had learned that storms, however fierce, always passed, leaving behind clearer skies and stronger foundations for whatever came next. And whatever came next, she and Hope would face it together, surrounded by women who had learned that their worth was not negotiable and their voices were not optional. The story that had begun with a millionaire's cruelty had become something larger, a testament to the power of women supporting women, and proof that even the most privileged abusers could not escape the consequences of their choices when their victims found the courage to demand justice. In the end, Richard Morrison had taught Victoria something valuable, though not what he intended. That midlife transformation was not only possible, but powerful. That financial independence was achievable even after years of financial abuse, and that narcissistic abuse could not survive in the light of truth and community support. Hope stirred one final time, opening her eyes to meet her mother's gaze. And Victoria saw in that look the promise of a future where no woman would have to choose between love and dignity, where no child would grow up thinking abuse was normal, where no millionaire ex-husband could destroy a family without facing the full consequences of his actions. "Welcome to your world, Hope," Victoria whispered. "We made it better for you."